The sheriff's deputy stood on my front porch with a clipboard, looking apologetically at me while I held a jar of honey in one hand and a bee smoker in the other. "Sir, we received a complaint that you're operating an illegal beekeeping operation on residential property," he said, and I knew exactly who had made that call. My name is Ethan Palmer, and I had been keeping bees in my backyard in Asheville, North Carolina for the past 4 years. I lived in the Pleasant Valley Estates, a neighborhood that had started out reasonable enough, but had slowly descended into HOA tyranny under the iron fist of our association president, Patricia Henderson. Patricia was the textbook definition of what people online call a Karen. Mid-50s, blonde highlights that were aggressively maintained, and a permanent expression that suggested she had just bitten into a lemon while simultaneously smelling something unpleasant. "I have all my licenses and permits," I told the deputy calmly, setting down the honey jar on the porch railing. "Would you like to see them?" The deputy looked relieved. "That would be great, actually. If everything checks out, I can put this to bed right now." I invited him inside and pulled out my file folder from the home office. Inside was my North Carolina apiary registration, my beekeeper's license, the city permit that explicitly allowed beekeeping on residential lots over half an acre, and even my certification from the local beekeeping association's training program. My property was 3/4 of an acre, well within the legal requirements. The deputy photographed each document with his phone and nodded. "This all looks completely legitimate, Mr. Palmer. You're well within your rights to keep bees here. Mind if I take a look at the setup, though?" "Just for my report." "Not at all," I said, leading him through the house and out the back door. My apiary consisted of 4 hives positioned along the back fence line, painted in cheerful colors: yellow, blue, green, and white. They were set up with proper stands, surrounded by a small garden of wildflowers and herbs that I maintained specifically for the bees. A small shed nearby housed all my equipment, everything organized and clean. The whole setup was about as professional as a hobbyist operation could get. "This is really impressive," the deputy said, keeping a respectful distance from the hives. "My grandfather used to keep bees. I remember helping him extract honey as a kid." "It's peaceful work," I said. "The bees are gentle Italians. They've never caused any problems with the neighbors." The complaint alleged that the bees were aggressive and posed a danger to children in the neighborhood. The deputy read from his notes. I laughed, though there was no humor in it. "There are exactly 2 children on this street, and they're both teenagers who come over sometimes to learn about the bees. Their parents sign permission slips and everything. The bees' flight path doesn't even cross into any other yards. See how they fly up and over." I pointed to where bees were leaving and returning to the hives, immediately gaining altitude to clear the tall fence. The deputy made notes. "Well, Mr. Palmer, you're completely in the clear legally. I'll file my report. If you receive any further harassment about this, you might want to document it." After he left, I stood in my backyard and watched my bees work. I had started beekeeping 4 years ago after my wife Sarah died. Cancer had taken her quickly, brutally, and I had been left adrift in this house that suddenly felt too big and too quiet. A friend had suggested I needed a project, something to care for, something that would get me outside. The bees had saved me in a lot of ways. They gave me purpose, routine, and something beautiful to nurture. For the first 3 years, I had been bringing fresh honey to the monthly HOA meetings. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to share something I loved with my neighbors. People had always seemed appreciative. Patricia herself used to gush about how much her book club loved the lavender honey I had brought to the September meeting last year. That had all changed 3 months ago at the January meeting. I had walked into the community center with 6 jars of honey, the winter harvest from my hives. It was darker this time, richer, from the late-season aster and goldenrod. I set them on the refreshment table as usual, next to someone's store-bought cookies and a bowl of pretzels. Patricia had been at the front of the room, shuffling through her papers with the self-importance of someone who believed running an HOA was equivalent to governing a small nation. When she noticed the honey jars, her expression had soured. "Ethan, can I speak with you for a moment?" she had said, her voice carrying that particular tone that suggested it was not actually a question. "Sure," I had said, walking over to where she stood. "I've been receiving complaints about your honey," she said quietly, though not quietly enough that the people nearby couldn't hear. "Complaints? What kind of complaints?" Some residents are concerned about allergens. Others have mentioned that home-produced food items aren't properly regulated for safety. She had smiled that tight, meaningless smile. "I'm sure you understand. We can't have just anyone bringing homemade food to community functions. Liability issues, you know." I had stared at her, trying to process what I was hearing. "Patricia, I've been bringing honey to these meetings for 3 years. No one has ever had a problem." "Well, things change. We need to be more careful about these matters. I'm sure you can understand from a legal liability perspective." She had patted my arm in a way that made me want to recoil. It's nothing personal, but it had felt personal. Especially when I found out later that Patricia's sister had just started selling honey from her own hives at the local farmer's market, and had been pestering Patricia to promote it in the neighborhood newsletter. I had quietly packed up my honey jars and taken them home that night. I had not brought any to the February meeting, or the March meeting. In fact, I had stopped attending the meetings altogether. Now, apparently, Patricia had decided that wasn't enough. She wanted my bees gone entirely. My phone rang while I was still standing in the backyard. It was my neighbor, Frank Morrison, who lived 2 houses down. Frank was retired military, straightforward and no nonsense, and one of the few people in the neighborhood who hadn't drunk the Patricia Henderson Kool-Aid. "Ethan, I just got off the phone with Patricia," Frank said without preamble. "She's claiming your bees attacked her while she was walking past your house." "That's impossible. I was home all day, and the bees haven't been aggressive at all. The deputy just left after inspecting everything." I figured she was lying. "She called me because I'm on the HOA board, wanted me to support some emergency action to force you to remove the hives. I told her to pound sand, but I thought you should know she's not done." "I appreciate the heads up, Frank. She's also planning to put it to a vote at the next HOA meeting. Wants to amend the covenants to ban dangerous agricultural activities on residential properties." Frank snorted. The woman's got too much time on her hands. After hanging up with Frank, I went inside and did what any reasonable person in 2025 would do. I started documenting everything. I wrote down the timeline of events, from the first honey rejection to today's deputy visit. I made copies of all my licenses and permits. I even set up my old GoPro camera on the back porch, angled to capture the hives and the flight patterns of the bees. The next morning, I found a letter in my mailbox. It was from the Pleasant Valley Estates HOA, printed on their official letterhead with Patricia's name at the bottom as president. "Dear Mr. Palmer, it has come to the attention of the HOA board that you are maintaining honeybee hives on your property in violation of the community covenants regarding nuisance activities and dangerous conditions. You are hereby ordered to remove said hives within 30 days or face fines of $100 per day until compliance is achieved. Additionally, this matter will be brought before the full HOA membership at the next quarterly meeting on April 15th, for a vote on permanent prohibition of beekeeping activities within Pleasant Valley estates. I read the letter 3 times, feeling my blood pressure rise with each reading. The covenants said nothing about beekeeping. I had checked them thoroughly before installing my first hive. The nuisance activities clause was vague and typically applied to things like running a car repair business out of your garage or keeping livestock that created noise and smell issues. I called my lawyer, Richard Green, whom I had used for the estate planning after Sarah died. He listened to the whole story and asked me to email him copies of everything: the HOA letter, my permits, the covenants, and the documentation of the deputy's visit. "They're overreaching," Richard said after reviewing everything. "The covenants don't prohibit beekeeping, and you're in full compliance with all city and state regulations. However, they can try to amend the covenants at a membership meeting if they get enough votes." "What's enough?" "According to your covenants, they need a 2/3 majority of all homeowners to vote in favor of an amendment. Not just those present at the meeting, but 2/3 of all homes in the subdivision. That's actually pretty hard to achieve. Most HOAs can't get 2/3 of their members to agree on anything. So what do I do about the 30-day removal order and the fines? You ignore it. It's unenforceable. They're threatening penalties for violating a rule that doesn't exist. If they try to actually fine you, we'll fight it. Keep documenting everything. If they harass you, record it, and definitely show up to that meeting in April." Over the next 2 weeks, things escalated. Patricia began a campaign that could only be described as a propaganda blitz. The neighborhood newsletter, which she controlled, featured a front-page article about the dangers of Africanized honeybees. Despite the fact that my bees were documented Italian honeybees, and Africanized bees weren't even a serious problem in North Carolina. There were vague references to residents who prioritized their hobbies over neighborhood safety. She posted in the neighborhood Facebook group about a dangerous situation that the HOA was working to resolve. When people asked for specifics, she replied with vague statements about liability and protecting property values. I received 2 more visits from deputies responding to complaints. One was about alleged bee swarms threatening people, which was absurd because it was early March and still too cold for swarming season. The deputy had been understanding but clearly annoyed at having his time wasted. The second was a noise complaint about loud buzzing, which the deputy couldn't hear even when standing directly beside the hives. "Madam, I'm going to be honest with you," I overheard the deputy saying into his phone during the second visit, apparently speaking to whoever had called in the complaint. "There's no noise violation here. The sound of the bees is barely audible even right next to the hives. I can't cite someone for keeping legal bees that are making normal bee sounds." My other neighbors started stopping by, and I was surprised by how many of them were supportive. The Kowalskis, who had 3 young kids, told me they loved watching the bees in their garden and had noticed they had more vegetables since I had started keeping hives. Margaret Chen, the elderly woman who lived directly behind me, brought me a thank you card for the honey I had given her last fall, which she said had helped with her allergies. "Patricia came to my house trying to get me to support her ban," Margaret said, shaking her head. "I told her she was being ridiculous. Your bees have never caused any problems." Even the teenagers I had mentioned to the deputy, Marcus and Tyler from 3 houses over, came by to tell me they thought the whole thing was stupid, and they were going to make sure their parents voted against any bee ban. But Patricia had her supporters too, or at least people she had managed to frighten with her dire warnings. The neighborhood busybody, Susan Walsh, started crossing the street whenever she walked past my house, making a big show of it. The Robertsons, who had only moved in 6 months ago and didn't know any better, mentioned to someone that they were concerned about their property values. I kept going out to tend my bees, checking their food stores, making sure they were healthy as they started ramping up their activity in the warming weather. The spring flowers were beginning to bloom, and the bees were bringing in bright yellow pollen. Watching them work was meditative, calming. It reminded me why I had started this in the first place. One afternoon in late March, I was in the backyard replacing a frame in one of the hives when I heard someone shout. I looked up to see Patricia standing at my back fence, her phone held up and pointed at me. "You're not wearing protective gear," she shouted. "This is exactly the kind of reckless behavior I've been talking about." I was wearing my bee suit, actually, but had pushed the veil back because I was just doing a quick inspection and my bees were calm. But I wasn't about to explain that to Patricia. "You're on my property, Patricia. Please leave." "I'm on the public easement," she snapped, though she was clearly standing right at the fence line on what was definitely my property. "I'm documenting the dangerous conditions for the HOA records." "Document whatever you want," I said, pulling my veil back down and returning my attention to the hive. She stood there for another 5 minutes, filming, before finally leaving. I made a note of the incident in my growing documentation file, including the time and what had been said. The April 15th meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. at the community center. I arrived at 6:45, wearing khakis and a button-down shirt, carrying a folder with all my documentation. Richard had offered to come with me, but I had decided to handle it myself first. He was on standby if things went sideways. The community center was more crowded than I had ever seen it for an HOA meeting. Usually these things drew maybe 20 people out of the 130 homes in Pleasant Valley estates. Tonight there had to be at least 70 people packed into the room. Patricia was at the front, arranging papers on a table with the 3 other board members. Frank Morrison, who had already told me he was on my side. Jennifer Wu, the secretary, who was generally neutral and just wanted meetings to end quickly. And David Patterson, the treasurer, who usually voted however Patricia wanted. I took a seat in the middle of the room. Several neighbors smiled or nodded at me. Others avoided eye contact. Patricia called the meeting to order at 7 sharp, running through the standard opening procedures with barely concealed excitement. She clearly thought she was about to win a great victory. "Before we get to new business," she said, "I want to address a serious safety concern that has been brought to the board's attention. One of our residents is maintaining dangerous honeybee hives that pose a threat to the health and safety of this community." "Oh, for crying out loud," Frank muttered, loud enough for people nearby to hear. Patricia shot him a look but continued. "I have documentation of multiple complaints, including reports to law enforcement about aggressive bees, noise disturbances, and concerns about allergic reactions. State law may allow beekeeping, but our community covenants give us the right to prohibit nuisance activities." She went on for another 10 minutes, painting a picture of my beekeeping operation as somewhere between a hazardous waste site and a terrorist training camp. It would have been funny if it wasn't so malicious. When she finally paused for breath, Frank spoke up. "Are you done with your presentation, Patricia? I believe I've made the concerns clear." "Great. Now let's hear from Ethan, since you're trying to force him to get rid of property that he legally owns and maintains." Patricia's face tightened. "This isn't a debate. We're here to vote on a covenant amendment. You're trying to amend the covenants based on accusations against a specific resident," Frank said. "The least you can do is let him respond to your accusations. Or are you afraid of what he might say?" Jennifer Wu nodded. "That seems fair, Patricia. Let's hear his side." Patricia sat down stiffly and I stood up, folder in hand. "Thank you," I said, moving to the front of the room. "I've been keeping bees in my backyard for 4 years. I have all the required licenses and permits from both the state and the city. I've brought copies for anyone who wants to see them." I held up the documents. "The police have been called to my property 4 times in the last month, always based on false complaints. Each time, the responding officers have found no violations, no problems, and no dangerous conditions. I also have those reports." I pulled out the incident reports I had requested from the sheriff's department through a public records request. "My bees are Italian honeybees, which are known for being gentle. They're positioned to fly up and over the fence line, not into neighboring yards. I've maintained detailed logs of their health and behavior. In 4 years, there has not been a single verified incident of anyone being stung by one of my bees." "What about me?" Patricia stood up. "I was attacked by your bees just 2 weeks ago. Were you stung?" I asked calmly. "I was chased." "But were you stung? Did you require medical attention? Do you have any evidence that the bees you claim attacked you actually came from my hives?" Her face was turning red. "I know what I experienced. I have a video camera recording my hives 24/7 now, specifically because of the false accusations. Would you like to give me the date and time of this attack? I can pull up the footage." She sputtered, and I continued. "The real issue here started 3 months ago when Patricia told me I couldn't bring honey to HOA meetings anymore. I respected that decision, even though several of you have told me you enjoyed the honey. I stopped coming to meetings because I felt unwelcome. But apparently, not attending meetings and not sharing honey wasn't enough. Now she wants to force me to destroy 4 years of work, get rid of pollinators that benefit everyone's gardens and violate my property rights, all based on manufactured complaints. This isn't personal," Patricia snapped. "Then why did it only become a problem after your sister started selling honey and you didn't want the competition?" The room went dead silent. Patricia's face went from red to white. "That's a ridiculous accusation," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Margaret Chen stood up from her seat. "Patricia, you tried to sell me your sister's honey last month, told me I shouldn't buy from anyone else because commercial honey is safer than hobbyist honey. I told you I preferred Ethan's honey and you got very rude about it." "I was trying to support local business," Patricia said weakly. "Ethan is local business," Frank said. "And you're abusing your position as HOA president to go after him because of it." The meeting devolved into chaos after that, with multiple people trying to talk at once. Some of Patricia's supporters tried to defend her, but most people were clearly on my side, or at least skeptical of Patricia's claims now that the honey connection had been made public. Jennifer Wu finally called for order. "I think we need to table the covenant amendment," she said. "We clearly don't have consensus and there are questions about the motivations behind this proposal. We need to put it to a vote," Patricia insisted. "Fine," Frank said. "Let's vote. All in favor of amending the covenants to prohibit beekeeping." About 15 hands went up, including Patricia's. All opposed. At least 50 hands went up. The rest of the people in the room abstained. "Motion fails," Frank said, decisively. Patricia looked like she had been slapped. "This isn't over. I'll call for another vote." "You can call for whatever you want," Frank said. "But you'd need 2/3 of all homeowners, not just the people in this room. That's 87 households. You just got 15 votes. You're nowhere close." The meeting broke up shortly after that, with several neighbors coming up to shake my hand or apologize for the whole situation. The Kowalskis invited me to their daughter's birthday party the following weekend. Marcus and Tyler asked if they could come by to help with a hive inspection. Patricia stormed out without speaking to anyone, David Patterson trailing after her like a puppy. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 3 days later, I came home from work to find one of my hives tipped over. The wooden box was on its side, frames scattered, bees everywhere in a confused, angry cloud. I immediately suited up and carefully set about assessing the damage and getting the hive back in order. It took 3 hours of careful work to get the bees settled and the hive reconstructed. Miraculously, the queen seemed to be okay, and most of the bees returned to the hive once it was upright. But several frames of brood were destroyed, and the stress on the colony was significant. I checked the GoPro footage immediately. At 2:15 in the afternoon, a figure in dark clothing and a hood had come into my backyard, walked directly to the hives, and pushed one over before running away. The camera angle didn't capture the person's face, but I could tell from the build and movement that it was a woman, and she was wearing what looked like garden gloves. I called the sheriff's department and filed a report. Deputy Collins, who had been one of the officers who had responded to the earlier false complaints, came out to take a statement and review the footage. "That's destruction of property and animal cruelty," he said, watching the video. "Do you have any idea who might have done this?" "I have a pretty good idea," I said, "but I can't prove it from this footage. The HOA president you mentioned, Miss Henderson. That would be my guess. I'll follow up with her. If she did this, we'll charge her." He looked at the bees, which were still more active than usual, flying in agitated patterns. "I'm sorry this happened. My mom actually started keeping bees last year after I told her about your setup. She's loving it." The deputy visited Patricia that evening. She denied any involvement, of course, and claimed she had been at her sister's house all afternoon, which her sister confirmed. But I noticed that, for the next few days, Patricia was suddenly very quiet. No more posts in the Facebook group, no visits to my fence line with her camera. Frank called me with the news that Patricia had resigned from the HOA board, effective immediately. She claimed it was due to the stress and lack of support from the community, Frank said. "But between you and me, I think David told her that we were looking into whether she had violated her fiduciary duties by using her position to target you for personal reasons. There were some legal concerns. What happens now? We'll have a special election for a new president. In the meantime, Jennifer is acting president, and I can tell you right now that she's not going to continue Patricia's crusade against your bees. That's a relief. How's the damaged hive doing? They're recovering. I'm feeding them sugar syrup to help them rebuild their stores. They should be okay." 2 weeks later, I was doing an evening inspection when I heard a knock at my back gate. I looked up to see Patricia standing there, not at the fence line but at the actual gate, waiting to be invited in. This was unexpected. I walked over, still in my bee suit but with the veil pushed back. "Patricia, can I talk to you for a minute?" I considered saying no, but curiosity won out. I opened the gate, though I didn't invite her any closer to the hives. She looked terrible. Her hair wasn't done, her clothes were wrinkled, and she had dark circles under her eyes. "I wanted to apologize," she said, the words clearly difficult for her. "I was out of line with everything. The complaints, the meeting, all of it. I waited. My sister did start selling honey, and I thought I was helping her. And then it became this whole thing, and I got caught up in it, and I made it personal when it shouldn't have been." She took a breath. "I didn't tip over your hive. I swear I didn't. But I know my behavior probably made you think I would do something like that, and I'm sorry for that too." "Did your lawyer tell you to come here?" I asked. She flinched. "Yes. I received a letter from your attorney about a potential civil suit for harassment and defamation. He suggested I might want to apologize and make amends. Of course. Richard had sent the letter without telling me, probably figuring it would either prompt a real apology or give us more ammunition if we needed to actually sue. Smart. I don't want to sue you, Patricia, I said. I just want to keep my bees in peace. I know, and you can. I resigned from the board. I'm not going to cause any more problems. She paused. I also wanted to ask if you would be willing to teach my sister some things about beekeeping. She's struggling, and her honey isn't selling well because it's not very good. You clearly know what you're doing. That was unexpected enough that I actually laughed. You want me to help your sister make better honey so she can compete with me. I know how it sounds. But the farmer's market is big enough for both of you, and she's invested a lot of money in equipment. She just doesn't know what she's doing. Patricia looked down, and I thought maybe if I did something to actually help instead of just trying to tear you down, it might make up for some of this. I thought about it. The truth was, the local beekeeping community was pretty collaborative. We shared knowledge, helped each other with swarms, and generally supported each other. And Patricia's sister, Angela, hadn't done anything wrong beyond having bad timing and a meddling sibling. Tell her to call me, I said. I'm willing to give her some advice. Patricia looked genuinely surprised. Really, really. But Patricia, if you ever harass me again, if you ever make false complaints or try to sabotage my property or interfere with my bees, I won't be this reasonable. Are we clear? Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Ethan. She left, and I returned to my hives, shaking my head at the strangeness of the whole interaction. Angela Henderson called me 2 days later. She sounded embarrassed but grateful. We met at her place the following weekend, and I spent 3 hours going over her setup, explaining what she was doing wrong. Everything from hive placement to honey extraction techniques, and giving her a reading list of good beekeeping resources. I'm so sorry about what Patricia did, Angela said as I was leaving. I had no idea she was going after you like that. I would have told her to stop if I'd known. It's done now, I said. Focus on your bees. They need you to be present, not worried about drama. Over the next month, things returned to something close to normal. The new HOA president was a reasonable guy named Tom Bradford who worked from home and just wanted to make sure everyone's trash bins were put away on time. He came by to introduce himself and assured me that the board had no interest in regulating beekeeping. I actually think it's great for the neighborhood, Tom said. My wife's been wanting to plant a butterfly garden, and having your bees around should help. I started bringing honey to the HOA meetings again, though I didn't attend every one. Life was too short to spend every month in a community center folding chair. But when I did go, people were friendly. The honey was always gone by the end of the meeting. Marcus and Tyler became regular fixtures in my backyard, learning about bee biology and hive management. Marcus wrote a school paper about pollinator conservation that won some kind of district award. Tyler decided he wanted to study entomology in college. Margaret Chen brought me seeds for my bee garden, special varieties that her mother had grown in Taiwan. The bees will love them, she promised, and she was right. The Kowalski's kids visited sometimes, watching the bees from a safe distance with wide-eyed wonder. Their youngest daughter, who was 5, drew me a picture of a bee that I put on my refrigerator. My hives thrived. The damaged one recovered fully, and by summer I had more honey than I knew what to do with. I sold some at the farmer's market, where Angela and I became friendly competitors. Her honey got better as she learned and practiced, and we often stood near each other, sending customers back and forth depending on who had the better variety for what they wanted. One Saturday in July, I was at my farmer's market booth when a woman approached with a young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old. "Are you the beekeeper from Pleasant Valley?" the woman asked. "I am," I said, not sure where this was going. "I heard about what happened with your HOA." My cousin lives in your neighborhood and told me the whole story. She smiled. I think what you do is amazing. My daughter is doing a project for her summer program about insects, and she wanted to meet a real beekeeper. I spent 20 minutes talking to the little girl about bees, showing her pictures on my phone of the inside of a hive, explaining how honey is made, and answering her surprisingly sophisticated questions about bee communication and colony structure. Thank you so much, the mother said as they left, carrying a jar of my wildflower honey. You've made her whole week. Moments like that reminded me why I had started keeping bees in the first place. It wasn't about the honey, though that was wonderful. It wasn't even really about the bees themselves, though I loved them. It was about being part of something bigger, contributing to the ecosystem, sharing something beautiful with others, and finding purpose in a world that had felt purposeless after Sarah died. In August, the neighborhood had a summer picnic in the community center park. I brought several jars of honey as a donation for the raffle baskets. Patricia was there with her husband, keeping mostly to herself, though she nodded politely when we made eye contact. There was no animosity, just a kind of awkward mutual acknowledgement that we had both moved on. Frank Morrison won one of the jars of honey in the raffle and immediately walked it over to me. I already have 3 jars at home that I haven't opened yet, he said. But I wanted to win it on principle. On principle, to prove that people here value what you do, even if some people were too dumb to see it at first. I laughed and told him to keep it anyway. Give it to someone who needs it. Later that afternoon, I was helping clean up after the picnic when Tom Bradford approached me. Hey, I wanted to run something by you, he said. A few of us were thinking it might be cool to have a community garden on that empty lot near the entrance. You know, the one the HOA owns but never does anything with. Okay, I said, not sure where this was going. We were thinking we could plant pollinator-friendly stuff, maybe have some educational signs about bees and butterflies. And we were hoping you might be willing to consult on it, maybe even give a workshop about pollinators for anyone who's interested. I'd be happy to help, I said, feeling a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the August heat. Great. Also, and this is just an idea, but what would you think about the HOA possibly keeping a community hive? You'd manage it, obviously, and we'd pay for all the equipment and supplies. Any honey from it could be sold to raise money for neighborhood projects. I was genuinely touched. That's a great idea. Let me think about the logistics of it. Over the next few weeks, I worked with a small committee of neighbors to plan the community garden. We designed it to have native plants that bloomed at different times throughout the season, providing food for bees and other pollinators from early spring through late fall. There would be benches where people could sit and watch the insects work, and educational plaques explaining the importance of pollinators. In September, we had a planting day. 40 neighbors showed up, including families with kids, retirees, and even some teenagers who probably could have been doing something cooler but chose to help anyway. We planted hundreds of flowers, coneflowers, black-eyed Susans, bee balm, salvia, Russian sage, and dozens of other species. I gave an impromptu talk about why pollinators matter, explaining how 1/3 of the food we eat depends on pollinators, how bee populations were under threat from habitat loss and pesticides, and how everyone could help just by planting the right flowers and avoiding chemicals. This is the kind of thing that makes a neighborhood special, Tom said to the group. Not rules and regulations and fighting over property values, but actually doing something positive together. There was genuine applause, and I saw more than a few people glancing at Patricia, who wasn't there. By October, the community hive was installed near the garden, a beautiful blue box that matched the aesthetic of the landscaping. I managed it the same way I managed my own hives, and it became a neighborhood attraction. People would stop by to watch the bees coming and going, and parents brought their kids to see. I offered a free beekeeping basics workshop on a Saturday morning, expecting maybe 10 people. 25 showed up, taking notes and asking questions. 3 of them told me afterward that they were thinking about starting their own hives. "Just make sure you get all your permits first," I said with a smile. The November HOA meeting was better attended than usual because we were debuting the first harvest from the community hive. 12 jars of beautiful golden honey. Tom proposed that we give 1 jar to each of the volunteers who had put the most work into the community garden, and donate the rest to the local food bank. Everyone voted in favor. As I sat there in the community center, surrounded by neighbors who had become friends, watching people pass around jars of honey and talk excitedly about expanding the garden next spring, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: contentment. The path from Patricia's harassment to this moment hadn't been easy or fun. There had been stress, anger, legal concerns, and genuine worry about losing something I loved. But in a strange way, the conflict had forced the community to confront what kind of neighborhood they wanted to be. Did they want to be a place of arbitrary rules and petty power games, or did they want to be a place where people were supported in their passions and contributions? They had chosen the latter, and that mattered. As the meeting wrapped up, Frank came over and clapped me on the shoulder. "You handled all of this with a lot more grace than I would have," he said. "I had good support," I said. "And honestly, I was just trying to protect my bees. Everything else kind of happened around that. Well, for what it's worth, I think you made this place better. Not just by keeping bees, but by standing up for yourself and not letting Patricia bully you into giving up something you cared about." I thought about that as I drove home that night, the mostly empty jars of honey rattling in the box on my passenger seat. Standing up for yourself was important, but so was knowing what battles were worth fighting. The bees were worth fighting for. They had given me purpose when I needed it, connected me with my community in ways I hadn't expected, and brought beauty and life to my corner of the world. When I got home, I went out to the backyard even though it was dark and cold. I couldn't see the bees, but I could hear the faint hum of the hives, that distinctive sound of thousands of wings creating warmth for the winter cluster. They were safe, thriving, doing what bees had done for millions of years. I thought about Sarah, who had never gotten to see my first hive but who would have loved every part of this journey. She had always believed that good things came from following your passions and standing firm in your convictions. She had been right. The next spring, 3 of my neighbors installed their own hives. Angela's honey won a ribbon at the county fair. Marcus got early acceptance to a college with a strong entomology program, and his admission essay had been about the summer he spent learning about bees. The community garden exploded with color and buzzing life, becoming a genuine source of pride for Pleasant Valley estates. And me. I continued doing exactly what I had been doing all along, caring for my bees, sharing honey with people who appreciated it, and living my life the way I saw fit on my own property. Patricia moved out of the neighborhood in June, something about her husband getting a job in Charlotte. I heard through the grapevine that she had joined the HOA board there within 3 months. Some people never change, I suppose. I wished Charlotte well and hoped their beekeepers had good lawyers. On a warm afternoon in late summer, I was sitting on my back porch watching the bees fly in and out of their hives, each one returning heavy with pollen, when Tom stopped by with his wife and their teenage son. "We were hoping you had time to do another hive inspection with us watching," Tom said. "Connor is thinking about starting his own hive next year, and I promised him a hands-on lesson from the expert. "I'm not an expert," I said, standing up and grabbing my bee suit, "but I'm happy to show you what I know." As we walked toward the hives together, Connor peppering me with questions about swarm prevention and honey extraction, I realized that this was what community was supposed to be. Not rules and restrictions, and people trying to control what their neighbors did, but people sharing knowledge, supporting each other's interests, and making space for everyone to pursue what brought them joy. The bees had taught me that. A hive works because every bee has a role, every bee contributes, and the colony succeeds through cooperation rather than domination. It's not perfect. There are still drones and workers and a queen, still hierarchy and structure, but it all serves the greater good of the hive's survival and prosperity. Maybe neighborhoods could learn something from that. I opened the first hive, carefully removing a frame heavy with capped honey, and held it up so Connor could see the perfect hexagonal cells, each one a tiny masterpiece of natural engineering. "This is incredible," Connor breathed, his eyes wide behind the veil of the spare bee suit I had lent him. "It really is," I agreed, and for the first time in a long time I felt genuinely excited about the future, not weighed down by the past or anxious about what might come next. I had my bees, my community, my purpose, and my peace. Patricia Henderson and the HOA drama was just a strange chapter in the story, not the ending. The ending was this: me in my backyard, teaching the next generation about bees, surrounded by thriving hives and the quiet hum of insects going about their vital work. The honey I had stopped giving to the HOA meetings had become a catalyst for change, a line in the sand that forced people to choose sides and ultimately brought out the best in most of them. Sometimes the things you stop doing matter just as much as the things you keep doing. I placed the frame back in the hive, carefully closed it up, and moved to the next one with Connor and Tom following, ready to continue the lesson. The bees flew around us, unbothered by our presence, focused on their work. They didn't care about HOA politics or property values or neighborhood drama. They just cared about flowers and honey and the survival of their colony. There was probably a lesson in that too. As the afternoon sun filtered through the trees and painted everything gold, I thought about how strange life was, how unexpected paths could lead to meaningful places, and how sometimes standing up for something as simple as beekeeping could change everything. The deputy who had first responded to Patricia's complaint had been right when he said beekeeping was peaceful work. But what he hadn't mentioned, what I had learned on my own, was that it was also powerful work, transformative work, the kind of work that connected you to the natural world and to your community in ways both visible and invisible. I would keep doing it for as long as I was able, teaching anyone who wanted to learn, sharing honey with anyone who wanted to taste it, and protecting my bees from anyone who tried to take them away. That was my promise to them, to Sarah's memory, and to myself, a promise I intended to keep no matter what the HOA or anyone else had to say about it. The bees hummed their approval, or maybe they were just being bees, but I chose to take it as agreement either way. After everything that had happened, I figured I had earned the right to a little anthropomorphization. Connor was asking about queen cells now, and I pulled another frame to show him, explaining the differences between worker cells and the distinctive peanut-shaped queen cells, demonstrating how you could tell if a hive was preparing to swarm. This was what mattered, this moment right here, the passing of knowledge, the wonder in a kid's eyes, the simple satisfaction of doing good work and sharing it with others. The rest of it, all the drama and stress and conflict, had faded into background noise, a temporary disruption in the steady, purposeful rhythm of the bees. And as I stood there in my backyard, surrounded by my hives and my neighbors and the late summer abundance of everything blooming and thriving, I knew with absolute certainty that I had made the right choice in fighting for this, in refusing to back down, in standing firm for my bees. They had saved me once, after Sarah died, giving me purpose when I was drowning, and I had saved them in return, protecting them from those who would have forced me to destroy what we had built together. That seemed like a fair trade, a good trade, the kind of reciprocal relationship that made life worth living, the kind of relationship worth fighting for every single time.